Hey guys, tonight we're dimming the lights, getting comfortable, and gliding back through history at a very, very relaxed pace. Think of this as the audiobook you didn't know you needed, but one that makes you quietly grateful you're not a medieval monarch with an extremely untrustworthy spouse. So, pour yourself some tea, slide under the blankets, and let's begin our calm little trip through some of the queens who, let's just say, had very short-lived patience for their husbands. And yes, in some cases, those husbands had suspiciously short-lived lives too, because as much as royal marriages were supposed to be about alliances and dynasties, sometimes they were about control, sometimes about fear, and sometimes, well, about murder. But don't worry, I'll be telling it in the softest, most relaxing way possible. All right, let's drift back to the 10th century. Empress Theophano of Byzantium. Our first royal spouse killer is Theophano, an empress of Byzantium. And if you know anything about Byzantium, you'll know it was essentially the Olympic games of court intrigue. Everybody was scheming, everyone was poisoning goblets, and honestly, if you made it past 40, you deserved a medal. Theophano was born around 941, supposedly the daughter of a tavern keeper, which already gave her a reputation that never quite left her. Because if you weren't born into the top-tier nobility in Byzantium, people tended to assume you were some kind of scheming temptress, and Theophano leaned right into that. She caught the eye of Romanos II, the emperor. He was young, flashy, and probably too confident for his own good. He married her, elevating her from commoner to empress, which, as you can imagine, made the old nobility grind their teeth down to dust. But here's the thing about Romanos II. He was not exactly the sharpest sword in the imperial armory. Chroniclers describe him as being more interested in hunting, drinking, and luxury than in ruling. He liked feasts, he liked baths, he liked women, and apparently he liked ignoring state affairs, which was, kind of the emperor's actual job. So, in the year 963, Romano suddenly died. He was 26 years old. Too young, really. Officially, he died after a long drinking bout, followed by a fever. But whispers at the time, and for centuries after, suggested that Theophano had a hand in it. Poison, most likely. Because when in doubt, medieval gossip blamed poison. And what do you know? Just weeks after his death, Theophano had cozied up with a dashing general named Nikephoros Phocas. Imagine, if you will, her husband dies suddenly, and before the palace walls are even cool, she's redecorating with her new man. Subtlety was not exactly her style. Nikephoros was a battle-hardened general, nicknamed the White Death of the Saracens, which I guess is a romantic title if you're into men who smell like steel and warhorse sweat, and she persuaded him to marry her, making him the new emperor. Problem solved, right? Not quite, because Nikephoros turned out to be, well, a bit of a bore. He was deeply religious, deeply ascetic. He slept on the floor instead of the imperial bed. He avoided luxury. He banned fancy clothes at court. Imagine being Theophano, raised from tavern life to silk-draped empress, and suddenly your new husband insists on rough wool and nightly prayers. Absolutely not. So, naturally, she found herself another man, a younger, livelier general named John Tzimiskes. Yes, that was his name. And with John's help, she plotted to get rid of poor ascetic Nikephoros. On a December night in 969, John and a few co-conspirators snuck into the imperial palace. Theophano herself apparently unlocked the doors. They crept into Nikephoros' chamber, where he was sleeping on the floor, like the world's dullest monk. And there, they murdered him. Brutally. Let's just say it wasn't quick. Nikephoros was gone, and John Tzimiskes became emperor. And Theophano thought, perfect, I'm back on top. But here's where the karmic wheel spins, because John, who had happily helped kill Nikephoros, promptly turned around and exiled Theophano from court. He decided she was too dangerous, which, to be fair, she was. It's almost impressive that he saw it coming. So Theophano ended her days in exile, remembered as the empress who murdered not one, but possibly two husbands, Romanos II and Nikephoros Phocas, which is honestly a resume item you don't see on LinkedIn very often. Let's float on from Byzantium now, glide forward a few centuries. Across Europe, queens and noblewomen were making similarly bold decisions, because marriage, for them, was rarely about love. It was about survival, power, and making sure you weren't the one getting quietly poisoned at dinner. Joanna of Naples. Next, let's stop in sunny Naples in the 14th century. Enter Joanna I of Naples, a queen who became infamous not just for ruling, but for the suspiciously untimely end of her first husband. Joanna inherited the throne of Naples at just 17, which sounds glamorous, but really it meant stepping into a political snake pit. Every noble faction wanted to control her. Every relative wanted a piece of her power. And her arranged marriage to her Hungarian cousin, Andrew, was supposed to secure things. Supposed to. Andrew was younger than Joanna, and, how do we put this politely, he was not exactly popular at court. The Neapolitan nobles saw him as an outsider, an annoying Hungarian who didn't belong in Italy, and Joanna herself apparently found him immature and unpleasant. Not the dream pairing. Now Andrew had one big ambition. He wanted the crown of Naples for himself, not just as Joanna's husband, but as king in his own right. And this terrified the Neapolitan nobility, because they did not want a foreigner calling the shots. So rumors began to swirl that Andrew might not live very long, and sure enough, in 1345, while staying in the town of Aversa, Andrew was lured out at night by a group of conspirators. He was attacked, strangled, and then tossed from a window. A dramatic exit, even by medieval standards. Who was behind it? Well, many pointed fingers directly at Joanna. She certainly benefited, since she continued as sole ruler after his death. And while historians debate whether she gave the order or simply looked the other way, the scandal stuck to her like glue. For the rest of her life, she was whispered about as the queen who murdered her husband. Of course, Joanna went on to marry 3 more times, because if you're going to be accused of husband killing once, why not at least make use of the reputation? And her life only got more tangled in politics, wars, and papal feuds. But Andrew's murder remained the defining shadow over her reign. And with that, let's take a gentle breath. We've drifted through Byzantium, through Naples, and we're only just beginning, because history is full of royal wives who decided that till death do us part was less of a vow and more of a personal challenge. But for now, let's rest here. In the next stretch, we'll move into even more infamous cases, queens whose power, ambition, or sheer boredom led to husbands meeting very permanent ends. Isabella of France and the awkwardly dead husband. So, let's gently move across the map again. We're floating now from Italy up toward rainy England in the early 14th century. Because if you're making a list of queens accused of killing their husbands, you cannot skip Isabella of France. She had the nickname the She-Wolf of France, which honestly, is a pretty metal name for someone who spent much of her life wrapped in wool gowns and plotting in chilly castles. Isabella was the daughter of the French king, Philip IV, and she was married off to Edward II of England when she was just 12, which sounds like the start of a fairy tale. Princess Mary's king becomes queen, but no, not even close. Edward II was, how shall we say this politely, not husband of the year. He had favorites at court, male companions who consumed his time and affection, and he basically ignored Isabella. Imagine being sent from Paris as a teenager, married into the English crown, and then realizing your new husband is more interested in hanging out with Piers Gaveston than with you. Rough. But Isabella wasn't a wallflower. She played the political game. Over time, she grew bitter, she grew ambitious, and she grew, well, done. Completely done with Edward, especially after he kept losing wars in Scotland and alienating the nobility. By the 1320s, half of England hated him, and Isabella decided to join the We Hate Edward Club. Now, Isabella did what many neglected wives in history did. She found herself a new man, Roger Mortimer, a nobleman who was both charming and, importantly, an enemy of Edward. The two became partners in both romance and rebellion. Subtle, right? In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England with an army. And here's the wild part. People actually welcomed them, because that's how unpopular Edward had become. He was captured, forced to abdicate in favor of his teenage son, Edward III, and locked away in a castle, which sounds bad enough, but worse was coming, because in September 1327, Edward II died in custody. Officially, they said he died from natural causes. Convenient, of course. But the rumors spread instantly that he'd been murdered, and not just murdered, but murdered in the most gruesome, humiliating way possible. Chroniclers later claimed he was killed by having a red-hot poker inserted into his body. Yes, that body part. And yes, people wrote this down with straight faces. Was it true? Probably not. It was most likely propaganda, invented by Edward's enemies or later chroniclers who couldn't resist the lurid detail. But still, it stuck forever. And who got the blame? Isabella and Mortimer, because they were the ones running England at the time. People assumed they ordered Edward's death to make sure he could never come back, which, to be fair, was a pretty logical assumption. So Isabella, the she-wolf, went down in history as the queen who killed her husband in one of the most infamous ways imaginable. True or not, that was the story that echoed through the centuries. Ironically, a few years later, her son Edward III overthrew Mortimer, had him executed, and politely shoved Isabella into retirement. She lived comfortably, weaving, praying, and probably reflecting on how her legacy would forever be tied to one very unfortunate poker story. Catherine de' Medici and the accidental husband death. Let's float now to Renaissance France, because if you want queens with reputations for being dangerous, you really can't avoid the Medici. Catherine de' Medici married King Henry II of France. She wasn't exactly his first choice, but politically it made sense. The problem? Henry was deeply in love with someone else, a noblewoman named Diane de Poitiers. Catherine was essentially a background decoration in her own marriage. Now here's the twist. Henry died in 1559, and the death was unusual. He was injured in a jousting tournament. A splintered lance pierced his eye and brain, which is about as unpleasant as it sounds. He lingered in agony for days before dying. Was this Catherine's doing? Well, no one proved it. It was technically an accident. But let's just say she did not exactly mourn. Once Henry was gone, Catherine seized power as regent for her young sons, and she clung to it fiercely. Of course, Catherine's real reputation for blood came later, with the Saint, Bartholomew's Day massacre, and her endless political machinations. But even so, her husband's bizarre death left whispers. Because what are the chances that an unloved queen just happens to get widowed by a freak jousting accident? Very convenient. Mary, Queen of Scots, and the suspicious explosion. And now, let's drift over to Scotland, because Mary, Queen of Scots, is basically the poster child for disastrous royal marriages. Her second husband, Lord Darnley, was, how do we phrase this, arrogant, entitled, and very possibly unhinged. He made enemies fast. He alienated the nobles. He annoyed Mary herself. And, most awkwardly, he demanded more power than she was willing to give. Their relationship spiraled. He got involved in conspiracies. He publicly embarrassed her. And by 1567, things were tense, to say the least. Then came the night of February 9th. Darnley was staying at a house in Edinburgh called Kirk o' Field, and in the middle of the night there was an explosion. The house was blown to pieces. Darnley was found dead in the garden. But here's the weird part. His body showed no burns or blast injuries. He'd apparently been strangled or smothered before the explosion. The blast was just a cover-up. And who was immediately suspected? Mary. Well, Mary and her lover, the Earl of Bothwell. It looked like they'd arranged the murder together. And when Mary married Bothwell just weeks later, it didn't exactly scream innocence. Now, whether Mary personally ordered it or whether Bothwell acted more independently is still debated. But in the public eye, she was forever stained. To the English especially, Mary became the dangerous, husband-killing queen, and that reputation eventually helped justify her imprisonment by Elizabeth I and her execution decades later. So, in Mary's case, the story isn't just about one husband conveniently dead. It's about how that murder defined her entire legacy, overshadowing everything else she tried to do. Let's take another calm pause. We've floated from the she-wolf of France through Renaissance jousting accidents and into Scottish explosions that were a little too on the nose. The pattern is clear. When queens got frustrated, their husbands tended to not last very long. But we're not done. There are plenty more royal wives whose marriages ended badly. For them, happily ever after was less about love and more about ruling alone. Poison, palaces, and the queens of the East. So, let's float eastward now, because Western Europe didn't have a monopoly on dangerous queens with inconvenient husbands. Russia, Poland, and beyond had their fair share, and their stories. Well, they're exactly the kind of thing you wouldn't want to hear if you were a medieval groom on his wedding night. Catherine the Great, and the horse story that never dies. Let's start with Catherine the Great. You've probably heard her name before. Empress of Russia, legendary ruler, builder of empire. And yes, you've probably also heard that rumor. The one about a horse. We'll get there. But first, her husband. Catherine married Peter III of Russia. He was technically the grandson of Peter the Great, which sounded impressive. Unfortunately, Peter was not impressive. He was awkward, immature, obsessed with toy soldiers, and very possibly not quite stable. He played with miniature armies in bed. He drank too much, and he insulted Catherine constantly. Not exactly an ideal czar. Catherine, meanwhile, was ambitious, smart, calculating. She understood Russia in a way Peter never did, and she realized very quickly that if she wanted to survive, Peter couldn't stay on the throne. So in 1762, Catherine staged a coup. She rallied the guards, charmed the nobility, and deposed her own husband after just 6 months of ruling. She declared herself Empress of Russia. Smooth, efficient, no hesitation. And what about Peter? Well, he was arrested and taken into custody. Just days later, he was dead. Officially, it was reported as hemorrhoidal colic, which is a hilariously unconvincing cause of death. In reality, he'd been strangled by Catherine's allies. Did Catherine directly order it? Hard to say, but it certainly made her job easier, and she never shed too many tears over it. She simply moved forward as ruler, and ruled for decades, cementing her reputation as one of the great monarchs of Russia. Now, about that horse rumor. It started circulating after her death, that Catherine was so depraved she died attempting to have intercourse with a stallion, which is, of course, ridiculous. She actually died of a stroke. The rumor was pure propaganda, spread by enemies who wanted to tarnish her name. But it stuck, in the way salacious rumors always do. To this day, people know the horse story more than her actual achievements, which is probably the cruelest legacy of all. So Catherine didn't just kill her husband, she outlived him, outmaneuvered him, and outreigned him. She may not have personally tightened the garrote, but let's just say she didn't lose sleep over his untimely end. Bona Sforza, the Poison Queen of Poland. Now let's move to Poland in the 16th century, where Queen Bona Sforza reigned. If her name sounds Italian, that's because she was born into the infamous Sforza family of Milan, a dynasty already notorious for scheming and poison. So when Bona married into the Polish royal family, everyone probably should have taken that as a warning label. Her husband was Sigismund I, King of Poland. By all accounts, it wasn't a terrible marriage. He was older, she was young, ambitious, and she quickly became a political player at court. She introduced new taxes, reorganized land, and generally acted like she was running things, which, in many ways, she was. But where Bona's real reputation blossomed was after Sigismund's death, because once widowed, she kept meddling in politics, arranging marriages, and enriching herself. And soon whispers began that she was using poison as her preferred political tool. Did she poison her husband? The rumors say maybe. Did she poison other nobles who got in her way? Also maybe. What's certain is that her name became tied to the very idea of poison in Polish folklore. To this day, the phrase Bona's poison survives as a folk expression, which, if you think about it, is kind of a brand identity. Her own death in 1557 was equally suspicious. Living back in Italy by then, she was supposedly poisoned by her own trusted officer, probably at the orders of the Spanish, who wanted to erase her debts. So, fittingly, the Poison Queen died by poison herself, a very neat, if somewhat dark, narrative arc. Roxolana, the Sultan's power player. And now let's float down to the Ottoman Empire, because queens, or in this case sultanas, also knew how to maneuver their husbands' fates. Roxolana, also known as Hürrem Sultan, started life as a slave. She was captured, brought to the Ottoman court, and eventually rose to become the favorite of Sultan Süleyman the Magnificent, which by itself was a huge leap from enslaved concubine to queen consort. Now, Roxolana didn't exactly kill Suleiman. He died naturally after decades of rule. But she did orchestrate plenty of deadly intrigue around him. particularly when it came to securing the throne for her own son. Traditionally, Ottoman sultans kept a rotating harem, and concubines weren't supposed to hold too much power. But Roxolana broke every rule. She married Suleiman legally, which was almost unheard of, and then she worked to eliminate rivals, especially the powerful viziers, and even Suleiman's eldest son, Mustafa. Mustafa was popular, capable, and widely seen as the heir apparent. But Roxolana wanted her own son, Selim, on the throne, so she whispered to Suleiman that Mustafa was plotting against him. Suleiman, paranoid and convinced, ordered Mustafa executed. So, while Roxolana didn't strangle her husband in bed, she manipulated him into killing his own heir, which is arguably just as dangerous. And when Suleiman finally died, Selim became sultan. Roxolana's long game paid off. Olga of Kiev, revenge on fire. Finally, let's drift even further back to the 10th century to meet Princess Olga of Kiev. She technically wasn't a queen, but she ruled as regent, and her story is too wild to skip. Olga was married to Prince Igor of Kiev, but one day Igor was killed by a rival tribe, the Drevlians. And Olga, well, she did not take it well. In fact, she unleashed one of the most creative and ruthless revenge campaigns in medieval history. First, when the Drevlians sent envoys to negotiate with her, she had them buried alive. Cozy. Then she invited more envoys, burned them in a bathhouse, and later massacred their nobles at a feast. Finally, she demanded tribute in the form of birds. Yes, birds. When the Drevlians complied, she attached bits of burning sulfur to the birds and released them. The birds flew back to their nests, setting the entire city on fire. So technically, Olga didn't kill her own husband, but she made sure everyone responsible for his death regretted it in spectacular, fiery fashion, which, in its own way, makes her one of the most dangerous royal widows in history. And with that, let's pause. We've floated through Russia, Poland, the Ottoman Empire, and even early Kiev. We've seen husbands strangled, poisoned, overthrown, and indirectly set up for disaster. And the pattern holds. Marrying royalty was less about happily ever after, and more about hoping you didn't end up mysteriously ill or suddenly strangled in a palace chamber. But we're still not at the end. There are more queens, more deaths, more quietly suspicious accidents waiting ahead. So let's keep gliding, gently, into the next round of history's most unfortunate royal marriages. Northern thrones and frozen marriages. We've floated through Byzantium, France, Russia, and beyond. Now let's drift north into the chilly kingdoms of Scandinavia. Because if you thought royal marriage was dangerous in sunny Naples or golden Constantinople, imagine trying to balance love, power, and dynastic politics while trapped in drafty castles in Denmark or Sweden. The drama was the same, just with colder weather and probably worse food. Christina of Denmark, the widow, who said, "No thanks." Let's start with Christina of Denmark. Technically, she didn't kill her husband, but she made one of the sassiest royal marriage comments in history. And it's worth including because it shows just how dangerous queens could be. Christina was married young to the Duke of Milan. Within a few years, he was dead, poisoned, assassinated, or just unlucky. It was Milan, so the options were endless. Christina, still a teenager, was suddenly a widow. Suitors came rushing in because that's what you did when a wealthy, well-connected widow was back on the market. And one of those suitors, famously, was none other than King Henry VIII of England. Yes, the guy with a track record of beheading wives. When asked if she'd consider marrying Henry, Christina is reported to have said, "If I had two heads, one should be at the King of England's disposal," which is perhaps the most elegant way of saying absolutely not. So Christina earns a spot here for sheer survival instinct. Sometimes the most dangerous queens weren't the ones killing husbands. They were the ones smart enough to avoid marrying dangerous men in the first place. Queen Margaret of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, the widow who outplayed them all. Now let's glide to Margaret I of Denmark. She wasn't a husband killer per se, but her story fits our sleepy theme of queens who came out on top, while their husbands did not. Margaret married Håkon VI of Norway. He wasn't the worst royal spouse, but he also wasn't particularly impressive. When he died in 1380, Margaret was left as regent for their son Olaf. Here's the twist. Olaf also died young, leaving Margaret as the sole power. Instead of fading into the background, she seized the opportunity. She declared herself ruler, maneuvered through the messy politics of the north, and eventually united Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under her control. This was the famous Kalmar Union, which lasted over a century. So Margaret didn't technically murder her husband, but she certainly outlasted him, outshone him, and ended up remembered as one of the most powerful rulers Scandinavia ever had, which, in its own way, was far more impressive than stabbing anyone in their sleep. Christina of Sweden, a husband avoider extraordinaire. And while we're in Scandinavia, let's check in with another Christina. This time, Christina of Sweden in the 17th century. Now, Christina never even bothered with a husband, which was probably the smartest decision on this entire list. She became queen at just 6 years old and grew up in a court that expected her to marry, produce heirs, and secure the dynasty. But Christina was not interested at all. She declared marriage a plague. She wore men's clothes when she felt like it. She surrounded herself with women she adored, intellectual companions, and artists. And when people pressured her about marriage, she flat out refused. Eventually, she abdicated the throne altogether, converted to Catholicism, and lived in Rome. And while she wasn't technically a husband killer, because there was never a husband, her rejection of the role entirely makes her one of the more subversive queens of history. Instead of waiting for a man to disappoint her or die, she cut that whole step out. Queen Caroline Matilda of Denmark, the affair that ended badly. Now, let's dip into Denmark again in the 18th century. Caroline Matilda was the sister of King George III of England, and she was married off to Christian VII of Denmark, which sounds glamorous. But Christian had issues. He suffered from severe mental illness, engaged in reckless behavior, and was generally unfit to rule. Caroline Matilda, lonely and stuck in Copenhagen, found companionship with the king's doctor, Johann Friedrich Struensee, and by companionship I mean full-blown affair. The two of them grew so close that Struensee effectively took over governing Denmark, introducing reforms and running the kingdom, while Christian played with dolls and descended further into instability. Of course, the Danish nobility was not thrilled about this. They launched a coup. Struensee was arrested and executed. Caroline Matilda was divorced and sent into exile, where she died at just 23. So, while Caroline didn't kill her husband, she did manage to undermine him so thoroughly that the court basically rewrote the rules around her. In the dangerous game of royal marriages, her downfall was swift, but not before she showed just how fragile those unions could be when the queen decided she was over it. Queen Gunhild of Denmark, medieval reputation, assassin. Let's glide back a little further into medieval Denmark. Gunhild was the wife of King Eric Bloodaxe. Yes, that was his real name, because apparently subtlety didn't exist in Viking naming conventions. Gunhild was known as ruthless, cunning, and ambitious. After Eric's death, she was accused of manipulating her sons into endless wars for power. Chroniclers painted her as the scheming widow who pulled strings behind the scenes, using poison, manipulation, and blackmail. Did she directly kill her husband? Number. But her reputation became so toxic that later legends claimed she used witchcraft, spells, and dark magic to destroy her enemies. Essentially, she was remembered less as a grieving widow and more as a medieval Bond villain, which, honestly, is a legacy in itself. A pause in the frozen north. So here we are, drifting out of Scandinavia. We've met queens who rejected marriage entirely, queens who outlasted dull husbands, queens who had affairs with doctors, and queens whose wit alone probably saved their necks. The pattern up here in the north is a little softer than in Byzantium or Naples. There's less outright stabbing and poisoning, more quiet maneuvering, surviving, and occasionally making devastatingly witty remarks about Henry VIII, which, let's be honest, might be the most powerful survival skill of all. As we keep floating, though, we'll head back into Central Europe. Because while the North had cold castles and clever widows, the heart of Europe had plenty of full-blown marital disasters where husbands ended up, well, very dead. The Habsburg Wives Club of marital misery. We've wandered through icy castles in Denmark, witty widows, and queens who refused to marry at all. But now, let's shuffle quietly back into Central Europe. And when I say Central Europe, I mostly mean the Habsburgs. Because if there's one dynasty that seemed cursed to produce unhappy marriages, it was them. It's like they sat around a family table and said, what if we just kept marrying cousins until everyone had the same chin? And then they did it, for centuries. The result? Sickly children, paranoid kings, and wives who had to decide whether to suffer through it or, occasionally, remove the husband from the equation altogether. Joanna of Castile, La Loca, with a side of poisoned love. Let's begin with Joanna of Castile. You may know her by her nickname, Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad, which, as usual, was a very fair and completely unbiased name given to her by the men around her. Joanna married Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, and let's pause there. The Handsome. That was his actual nickname, and yet descriptions of him vary wildly. Some said he was indeed attractive, others not so much. But either way, he was not handsome enough to excuse his behavior. Philip was a serial philanderer. He cheated constantly. He flaunted mistresses. He undermined Joanna politically. And to top it off, he tried to declare himself sole ruler, cutting her out entirely. Did Joanna kill him? Well, the rumors said poison. Philip died suddenly in 1506 at just 28 years old. Joanna was blamed by some, mourned by others, and mostly dismissed as hysterical. Whether or not she poisoned him, her reaction was unsettling. She refused to let his body go, literally. She traveled with his corpse, demanded it be opened repeatedly to make sure he wasn't seeing mistresses in the afterlife, and had the coffin placed where she could watch over it. So, was she a husband killer? Maybe. Was she a tragic example of what happens when you marry a Habsburg cousin with wandering eyes? Definitely. Isabella of Portugal, married to a man who preferred monks. Next, let's float to Isabella of Portugal, who married Emperor Charles V, the Habsburg poster child for too much chin, not enough joy. Charles was constantly away, ruling his scattered empire. When he was around, he was brooding, serious, and more interested in religion than his wife. Isabella, meanwhile, was politically competent, capable, and stuck holding the empire together while Charles sulked in monasteries. She didn't kill him, but after her death at 35, Charles essentially gave up on ruling. He withdrew more and more, eventually retiring entirely to a monastery, where he spent his days timing the tolling of church bells and eating plain food. So, Isabella may not have murdered her husband, but she drained him of the will to rule simply by dying young, which, in the strange logic of royal marriages, sort of counts as fatal influence. Maria Anna of Austria, married to a man who married his niece. And then there's Maria Anna of Austria. Poor Maria Anna was married to Ferdinand III, who was fine. Not a monster, not a genius, just sort of bland. But what makes this story sad is that her son, Emperor Leopold I, carried on the Habsburg tradition of aggressively inbreeding. Leopold married his own niece, twice. That meant Maria Anna lived just long enough to see the family dive headfirst into a genetic dead end. She didn't kill her husband, but her family tree certainly tried to kill itself. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, married to a melancholy emperor. Fast forward a couple centuries to Empress Elizabeth of Austria, better known as Sisi. She's remembered today as a tragic beauty, slender, reclusive, obsessed with exercise, and deeply unhappy. She was married to Emperor Franz Joseph I, who was rigid, dutiful, and about as much fun as a wet blanket. Their marriage was a disaster almost immediately. Franz Joseph's mother, Archduchess Sophie, dominated the household, taking control of the children and criticizing Sisi endlessly. Did Sisi kill her husband? Number. But she killed his spirit in small, subtle ways. She avoided him, traveled constantly, and left him isolated in Vienna while she sought freedom elsewhere. Their marriage was a ghost of itself for decades. When Sisi was assassinated in 1898 by an anarchist, Franz Joseph reportedly said, "No one knows how much I love this woman," which, if true, makes their cold, distant marriage all the more depressing. Anna of Austria, queen who outmaneuvered her husband's ghost. One more Habsburg, Anna of Austria, married to Philip II of Spain. Now, Philip had already been married 3 times. Anna was wife number 4, and, charmingly, also his niece. Yes, his niece. Again, the family tree looked less like a tree and more like a tightly wound shrub. Anna was pious, quiet, and obedient. She produced children, managed the household, and kept her head down. Philip, meanwhile, micromanaged his empire to death, obsessed over paperwork, and alienated everyone. Anna died young, at 30, and Philip mourned her deeply. But here's the thing. Anna's descendants would eventually outmaneuver Philip's obsessive legacy. Her line produced rulers who inherited the throne long after his endless paperwork was forgotten. In that sense, she triumphed in death. The Habsburg pattern. So, what's the theme here? Habsburg marriages rarely ended in outright murder. They ended in madness, exhaustion, melancholy, and children who looked alarmingly like their grandparents. Wives sometimes outlived useless husbands. Sometimes they were rumored to have poisoned them. Sometimes they just quietly suffocated them with cold indifference. The real danger in these marriages wasn't knives or daggers. It was genetic collapse, power struggles, and the crushing boredom of being married to a man who preferred ledgers and prayers to actual human company. A breath before the next round, so let's pause here. We floated through queens who may or may not have poisoned their way to freedom, women who spent decades quietly outmaneuvering their husbands, and dynasties so obsessed with keeping bloodlines pure that they practically destroyed themselves. It's a different kind of danger than the dramatic assassinations of Byzantium or the affairs of Denmark, but no less fatal. Because in the Habsburg world, sometimes the deadliest queen was simply the one who stayed alive long enough to watch the dynasty collapse under its own weight. Up next, we'll keep drifting, but this time into England and Scotland. Because if there's one stage where queens absolutely did kill, or at least dethrone, their husbands, it's the British Isles. The Isles, the Bourbons, and the final curtain. We've drifted through Byzantium, Italy, Russia, Scandinavia, and the Habsburg labyrinth. Now let's quietly float toward the misty islands of England and Scotland before finally gliding back to France for a last round of royal marital disasters. Because if you thought poisonings and cousin marriages were dramatic enough, just wait until we get into Henry VIII's wives and the fate of Mary, Queen of Scots. Here, queens didn't just quietly outlive husbands, they often helped arrange their downfall. Anne Boleyn, the queen, who didn't last long. Let's start with the most famous of Henry VIII's wives, Anne Boleyn. Anne wasn't exactly a husband killer herself, but her marriage to Henry VIII caused more chaos than almost any other in history. Henry broke from the Catholic Church just to marry her, triggering the English Reformation. That's a pretty dramatic marital side effect. But Anne's problem was simple. She didn't give Henry a son. She gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, who would one day become one of England's greatest rulers. But Henry wasn't impressed. Soon, rumors flew. Accusations of adultery, witchcraft, and even incest with her own brother. None of it was proven, but none of it mattered. Henry wanted her gone. Anne was executed in 1536, leaving Henry free to try again. So Anne didn't kill her husband, but she paid the price of being the kind of wife who challenged him, and history remembers her more vividly than Henry's other queens. In a sense, the real danger in this marriage wasn't Anne, it was Henry himself. Catherine Parr, the survivor. Now let's skip ahead to Henry's last wife, Catherine Parr. Catherine had already been widowed twice before she married Henry, which sounds like the plot of a very bleak romantic comedy. By the time she became queen, Henry was obese, ulcer-ridden, paranoid, and not exactly a dream husband. Catherine was clever. She flattered Henry, supported his children, and avoided most political minefields. But even she nearly fell victim to his paranoia. At one point, Henry signed an arrest warrant against her for heresy after she debated religion with him a little too confidently. Catherine, realizing the danger, rushed to Henry in tears, begged forgiveness, and claimed she'd only been arguing to distract him from his pain. Henry, flattered, withdrew the warrant. Catherine outlived Henry, making her the only one of his 6 wives to do so safely. And, in classic queenly fashion, she remarried almost immediately. She was finally free, until childbirth claimed her life a year later. Mary, Queen of Scots, the most infamous husband killer. Now let's turn north to Scotland. If there's one queen who truly earns a place on this list, it's Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary was young, glamorous, and endlessly unlucky. She married Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, who was handsome but arrogant, violent, and, worst of all, ambitious. Darnley resented Mary's power and even participated in the murder of her secretary, David Rizzio, stabbing him dozens of times in front of a pregnant Mary. That's not exactly husband of the year material. A year later, Darnley was found dead. His house had exploded mysteriously one night. His body was discovered outside, apparently strangled, not burned, which suggests someone made sure he didn't survive even if the blast didn't finish the job. Suspicion immediately fell on Mary and on her close ally, the Earl of Bothwell. Within months, Mary married Bothwell, which made the whole thing look very suspicious indeed. Public opinion turned against her, and eventually she was forced to abdicate. She fled to England, where her cousin Elizabeth I kept her under house arrest for nearly 2 decades before executing her. So Mary may not have personally lit the fuse, but she was forever linked to her husband's death. History remembers her as the glamorous doomed queen whose marriage literally exploded. Elizabeth I, the Virgin. Queen's escape. Let's pause with Elizabeth I, Mary's cousin and rival. Elizabeth famously never married. And while she wasn't a husband killer, her refusal to take a husband was arguably the smartest move of any queen we've covered. She saw what happened to her mother, Anne Boleyn. She saw her cousin Mary's disasters. She knew that marriage meant losing power, or worse. So Elizabeth stayed single, styling herself as married to her country instead. She flirted endlessly with foreign princes and English nobles, but never committed. And in doing so, she avoided the fate of so many queens who found themselves trapped, betrayed, or accused of killing their husbands. Sometimes the deadliest move is to step off the board entirely. Catherine de' Medici, the queen mother who outlived them all. Now let's drift back across the Channel into France, because if there's a queen who truly embodies the idea of dangerous wife, it's Catherine de' Medici. Catherine married Henry II of France. She was Italian, from the powerful Medici family, and not initially popular at the French court. Henry openly preferred his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, giving Diane all the gifts and attention that should have gone to his wife. But Catherine played the long game. When Henry died in a jousting accident, Catherine finally stepped into power as queen mother to her young sons. And that's when her reputation for poison, plots, and manipulation really took off. Did she kill Henry? Probably not. But she certainly didn't mourn him long. She wielded influence for decades, orchestrating marriages, manipulating nobles, and surviving one of the bloodiest eras of French history, including the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. So while she didn't technically kill her husband, she certainly outlasted him and became one of the most feared women in Europe. Marie Antoinette, the queen who couldn't win. And finally, let's glance at Marie Antoinette. She married Louis XVI of France, a shy, awkward man more interested in locks and keys than romance. Their marriage was mocked for years because it remained unconsummated for so long. Eventually, they did produce children, but by then, public opinion was poisoned against her. Rumors painted Marie Antoinette as a decadent foreigner, a manipulator, even a traitor. She was accused of controlling Louis, of ruining France, of every crime imaginable. And when the revolution came, both of them went to the guillotine. So no, Marie Antoinette didn't kill her husband, but history framed her as if she had. In the eyes of the angry crowd, she might as well have. Drifting to a close. So what have we seen on this long, drowsy journey? Queens who poisoned their way out of bad marriages. queens who survived by outliving their husbands, queens whose husbands mysteriously exploded, queens who rejected the whole idea of marriage altogether. The theme is clear. In the world of dynasties, marriages were less about love and more about politics. And when politics and personal misery collided, husbands often ended up dead, or at least humiliated. But the real danger wasn't always daggers or poisoned goblets. Sometimes it was simply being married to a woman smarter, tougher, or more determined than the king himself. So as we close the curtains on this long, sleepy tale, dim the lights, pull the blanket a little closer, and remember, behind every great king was usually a queen wondering how quickly she could outlive him. Good night.